Hiya, part number 3 of 4. So, how are you with the social distancing thing? I mean, it's weird, isn't it? That whole business of keeping apart. Tom Groom wrote a lovely book about what makes us Catholic, and in it he focused one of his chapters on the idea that we're made for each other. In fact, he used that phrase, we're made for each other. You've often probably heard it in a wedding where people look at two people and they go, look at them, they were just made for each other. And you go, well, in a sense, that's profoundly true. It turns out at one level, we're all made for each other. For those of you who are interested, it's part of what theologians call social teaching. But we have a certain responsibility to each other that exercises itself in love. Now here's the thing, what happens to us when we're forced, coerced, rightly, to stay apart? For some, it was particularly painful because they were asked to be apart from people within their own kinship, their own families. And here we are trying to resolve who we are when we're on our own. Now, here's the thing. When you read Pope Francis, he often talks about us being shoulder to shoulder with Jesus, shoulder to shoulder with our neighbour. That being, in a sense, a certain completeness. Not meant to be distanced, not meant to be isolated, that we're not particularly at our best when we're lost to each other. I learnt this, of all things, from a small child. I went into a primary school and standing aloof behind the secretary, high on the wall, was a statue of Mary, the mother of Jesus. She was extending her hands thus, and to be honest was covered in dust and looked a bit forlorn, a bit worried. And I looked at her. She was definitely socially distanced. And I said, look, I'm going to do a lesson with the children today. Do you mind could I use the statue? So we took the statue off the plinth and brought it down and dusted it and took it into the hall and placed it in the middle of a large school room. And the children came in, the eldest at the back, the youngest at the front. And I started to talk about Mary and her role in the scriptures. And it seemed to be going okay. But actually, the children nearest to the statue, who were the youngest and probably the least inhibited, they started to edge forward. They couldn't be distanced even from a statue. And as I talked about this woman, one of the smallest of children, a little girl, perhaps with a little bit more courage, put her weight onto her hand and leaned forward and began to stroke the cheek of this statue. And in that profound action where she was completely unaware of those around her, I discovered the longing in our hearts for love. There's no life can be lived without it. And there she was, as if to reassure Mary, the mother of Jesus. We were not meant for distancing ourselves. In fact, Pope Francis, Pope Benedict and St. John Paul II all make a big play on the importance of a neighbour in the life of our schools. That somehow it is the connection between us that defines us. Recently, the church gathered a synod to consider young people. And it was very interesting because one of the things that came out of that synod and eventually found its way into one of the writings of Pope Francis was a contribution from a young person from the Samoan Islands who compared the church or your school to a group of people in a canoe and said, there were the elderly looking at the stars and plotting the direction, and there were the young paddling like fury to move this canoe. That somehow we're a group of people shoulder to shoulder on a journey together. It was how we were meant to live. It's a healthy way to see your school. You know, there are some at the helm steering, there are some paddling like fury. There's usually somebody asleep. There's probably a few who don't quite even know why they're there, but somehow in the connection of us is who we really are. The word that Pope Francis uses for that is to accompany one another, and it's worthy of more time. But perhaps if I could give you this analogy or reference. I was getting on a tube train one day in the height of summer, in a time when people were not socially distanced at all. It was really, really hot and sticky and unpleasant. And we get onto the tube train, crammed together, and into the tunnel we go. And before you know it, we hear a voice in the distance. Ladies and gentlemen, I've come to talk about the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, the people around me ran for cover. The guy next to me lifted up his newspaper in self-defence. The woman opposite me took the hand of her child as if to say, it's all right, I've got this, it's okay. The two girls in front of me, I think were Spanish, were talking to each other, one translating to the other. They were giggling, and the speaker continued. We pulled into the next station, the doors opened, the man left, and things carried on. In fact, more than that, there was a sigh of relief in the carriage, as if the threat had gone away. My problem was this. On the one hand, I admired his courage, his conviction, his concern, perhaps to reach people. But in another way, I found it intrusive and irritating and a bit embarrassing, if I'm honest, because for whatever the good intention, it wasn't working. And I was left wondering, was he right or am I right? Was that a good thing to do or a stupid thing to do? But I discovered something quite rich that day. It took me a while, but actually, my real problem with that man and his shouting was that he got off the train. What do I mean by that? I mean, he didn't know my name. He didn't know my life. He didn't understand the challenges I'm facing or the mess that I'm in. He didn't understand anything about me. He just had his message. And despite being very close to us physically, he was a long way from us spiritually. I want to say this to you about your school. You don't do that. You accompany children, young people, slowly, gently, persistently, perseveringly into adulthood. You know their names. You know the strain, the sensitivity, the issue, the pain, and you accompany them. You stand by them, shoulder to shoulder. It's breathtakingly beautiful, and it's worth getting out of bed in the morning for. On a bad day, we can't see it. Let's face it, other things take over, and all you need to ruin a good lesson is a wasp. I know that. But on a good day, we gently reach forward and we stand shoulder to shoulder with people at times through the hardest of times. And it's what our schools were built for, to accompany in proximity with the love of a small child caressing the face of a statue. So, part 3. How were you with being distanced? And is it time to rethink how we connect? And on this occasion, particularly with the people we work with, maybe we've rediscovered that a glass of wine with a few colleagues is what makes the job worthwhile. So question, is it time to pay more attention to each other? And what would that look like? See you in a bit. Bye.